Climate change activists are impotent. That's the title of this video. More on that later. First, a word from our sponsors. This video is brought to you by Wikipedia. Super pedagogical watchdogs. Click on the tooltip below this video to re-educate yourself, you fucking pleb. Historically, climate change activists have failed to achieve their aims in a bitter fashion. The blame is cast everywhere, but rarely inward. Climate activism and its fruits have proven to be more of a fool's errand than a righteous cause. And as each goalpost to limit carbon emissions is moved, activists have faltered and have kowtowed around popular rhetoricians, dismal actors, and self-dealing state officials in a half-measured effort to garner political attention, of which will artificially inflate in tandem with the run-up to the 2024 US elections. Pervasive doubts in the increasingly agitated, alienated commoner, doubts of institutions, of authorities, of activists and activism. The citizenry contends with the contradicting ideals of net zero, of greenwashing and ESG scores of corporations, especially in this decadent, stagnant landscape of business as usual. When the movement's mascot is of the likes of Greta Thunberg,
if we can save the banks, then we can save the world.
Or when political candidates tap into the primal fears of extinction in their voter base.
Farms, towns that will never come back.
It is a climate crisis, but let's make this a climate opportunity.
Clear and present danger, and that's what climate change is about.
People are more concerned about helping oil companies.
The effects of climate change.
To tackle climate change.
Code red for humanity.
I don't think so.
Or when one of the movement's high priests says this.
We're still putting 162 million tons into it, and the accumulated amount is now trapping as much extra heat as would be released by 600,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every single day on the Earth.
Examples like these should make it obvious.
Is climate change racist?
Why the movement was and is doomed to fail. It's difficult to cohere exactly. It's peopled by stupid neurotics and shitty authoritarians, and it's psychologically damaging to engage with it beyond paying it lip service for political points or to evade social blackmail if you dissent. They'll say things like, we ought to have employed all aspects of government and capital to slow the spread. To stop burning oil. They'll say things like, a Green New Deal must be enacted or it's death by climate. Dumbfounded at how straightforward it is to save the world and how we should just go fucking green already. Instead, due in part by climate activists' inability to effect any workable solution, one that doesn't involve half-baked punitive measures of taxing both consumer and corporation, piddling around summit talks and UN conferences with vague aspirations and a whole lot of disappointed finger-pointing, or the godhead pretensions of halting civilization's cogwheels in order to achieve this mythical net zero carbon emissions. The movement now resembles controlled opposition rather than a force to be reckoned with, especially in the face of the promised danger awaiting us at 1.5 Celsius. Apologies for my shabby appearance. I just got back from my menial day job where I spent all day contributing to the collapse of civilization. Yes, climate change is a real phenomenon, and it might very well be an existential threat. Yes, humanity has affected the climate to some degree, perhaps largely, by mechanisms we understand and by mechanisms we don't. And although the narrative's adjudicators insist that 100% of climate change is human-caused, we can't definitively agree on anything downstream from the extremes, because the problem is hard and the economic instantiations are perilous, and the arguments made by both activists and quote-unquote denialists are misguided.
The latest computer models indicate it's just going to get worse and worse for everybody. Bill Nye, science guy, what can I do about climate change? We need big ideas. So everybody, what you can do about it is vote. Vote for people who are going to do something about it.
There's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word. Climate is about everything. Work really hard to provide cheap, reliable energy, at the lowest cost possible to the widest number of people worldwide, and the emergent consequence of that would be the whole planet would clean itself up.
The chief of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Command, Admiral Samuel Locklear, recently said that climate change is our single greatest security threat.
The reactionary politicizing associated with the climate change movement has no doubt arisen from a belief that the science also carries with it a set of prescriptions and moral imperatives, which is a palpable misunderstanding of the science as it stands, and is nothing short of culty, firebrand sermons communicating simplistic summaries of deeply complicated sciences to the masses, compelling them to act, otherwise death and rapture awaits God's country. The wrath and despair engendered at picket lines and demonstrations, the sloganeering of righteous indignation, and, you guessed it, the advocation of dismantling capitalism, while passerbyers plug their ears at the din and just want to go about their day in peace. All of this ruckus seems to be stoked by mass media reporting and the routine PSAs conducted by open-handed politicians, and, you guessed it, the subversive campaigns originating the big three of capital, the gods of private equity. The urgency of action markets itself as pro bono, 0% APR, no money down, yet demands payment up front, tendered by toothless reaction and infinite debt. What are you, fucking stupid? We must save the planet now. And if climate change activists fail to lead the charge, fail to triage at the very least, then they'll be completely delegitimized, regardless if the Earth chokes and coughs its way to an uninhabitable hell, or if the Earth huffs and puffs and nothing happens and we forget all about it when the next Marvel movie graces our plebeian screens. Or worse yet, when that air of we must save the planet dies out and defeat spurs our bones. Despair and suicide and childlessness is the only rational way to cope with impending invisible doom. Climate fatalism just means higher consumptive habits, increasing detachment and apathy, and the loss of responsibility and self-determination that everyone needs. Because who cares? It's all going to shit anyways. It's our contemporary eschatology, climate change, the end times. A market of alarmism and the immediacy of reporting incentivizes misinformation and can affect our judgments to the point where we do all the wrong things, like preparing to fight goblins where there are Goliaths, or vice versa, or expanding government to satisfy the bills of a complete overhaul of our energy infrastructure, even though government by far is one of the leading emitters of greenhouse gases.
You have to be on the right side of history. We are many who are judging you and who are watching you.
Perhaps if we focus less on saving the planet and more on just waiting it out, we'd see who's really on the right side of history. I mean, I'd imagine the outcomes will be the same, regardless. The planet, which we've come to understand through millennia of human history, the planet is conspiring with nature and actively trying to kill us at almost every juncture. We live on a knife edge of existence, with climate change being one of millions of balanced agitators. Holding up signs, making noise, and taking up space isn't going to cut it. Shaming the rich and powerful for their consumptive lifestyles and significant carbon footprints won't either. Stopping commerce and the commute of the working class in peacefully antagonistic rallies, where bitchy bodies ironically pose as obstacles to business as usual, nor is reading Greenpeace and Just Stop Oil newsletters and reposting evidence of your recent donations to social media, nor does vandalizing classical works of art in museums like an idol-smashing jihadist. It's the worst kind of performance art if you ask me. Yeah, that doesn't recruit a soul to the cause. Climate change activists are impotent because these demonstrations are mere child's play. And I mean, they're social games of ego stroking and the small consequences of masturbatory mobs. Real belligerence looks like sophisticated criminality, felonious damage done to the assets of the rich and powerful who grind the gears of big pollution. Cybersecurity attacks directed at war pig institutions that inflict destruction and death elsewhere. You know, that's real agitation, that's real activism, that's real belligerence, not this. As Andreas Malm says in his 2020 book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline,
action should be undertaken if plan, goal, and execution can be explained and garner support in an intimate relation to the existing consciousness to be pushed up a notch. This is one reason why it would be a very bad idea indeed to assassinate a coal executive or fly an airplane into an ExxonMobil skyscraper. Intelligent sabotage is something else.
If the climate change activist wants to be uber effective in their activism, they've got two real options as I see it. They can either, one, become master saboteurs, physically detonating the fault lines of industry, or metaphorically distributing caltrops while employed in powerful positions at big energy firms, or blowing up the Nord Stream. The number one is becoming a master saboteur. Or the second option, number two, you can simply pursue a STEM degree, get into material sciences, or a similar field, innovate technologies of energy capture and storage of renewable energy sources, or just, invest in nuclear. I don't know. If you don't like fossil fuels or their usage, then help make a better alternative or assist in the efforts of making the alternatives more economically viable. I guess it's not really activism, but it can be. As an activist, anything that you could do besides those two, in my view, is just futile. Joining groups and donating time and resources to inconsequential zealots, retweeting Thunberg and UN spokespeople, attending rallies and mass protests, it's ineffective, it's cheap. And the perpetuation of false alarmism that is downstream from all this, I mean, false as in there's no real emergency protocol. The perpetuation of this false alarmism keeps us all mad and overconsumptive and credulous and depressed. It's just impotent, ineffective. Blowing shit up, violent destruction of property, micro mayhem deployed municipally to put a halt to business as usual sounds like a party. And while immediately effective, would this diminish the fossil fuel industry to the point of shuttering their businesses? Probably not. Yet one must consider a pernicious byproduct of measures like these, the wrenching of the economic cogwheels of our industrial enterprise, and all the unintended consequences that'll soon follow. When climate activists argue short-term sacrifices are required of us all if we are to stave off the coming end times, usually with some air of nobility and righteousness, these sacrifices are understood to be the right thing to do, inspiring a sense of duty and hope and mood-ruining our days because we know full well we ain't doing none of that shit. But what's often missed in this pernicious prescription, these short-term sacrifices, they're really talking about the casual suffering, malnourishment, and endless and needless death as a result of the destabilization wrought on local economies. Short-term sacrifices means the deliberate ravaging of logistical networks of the country, food and consumer staples immobile and rotting away in nowhere warehouses, an unfurrowing of the social infrastructure as scarcity and sharp demand curves engenders fear and survival brain in the masses. And all of this just to delay an inevitable, sacrifice indefinitely until death? That doesn't make any sense. Now imagine we course corrected, as if we were all of unitary mind, like good communists, and civilization went net zero over a 5-year period. It's possible, right? But not without a world's worth of wounding none of us are prepared for. Unelectrified slums, sanitation and water systems dissolved, near empty markets with Weimar prices, your general economic ruin. Well, at least it was us that did it and not the climate, right? To top it with cherries, those short-term sacrifices inflicted on the public won't be endured by the airheaded donor class, the vacuous climate celebrities, the silver-spooned and lucky. They'll skirt the consequences of said sacrifices, and they'll cheer us on the whole way, won't they? The insisters, the thinly veiled degrowth projecteers, these media-trained confidence actors involved in the climate discourse should not control your outlook on the climate and your future, as they've only sought to persuade, not to inform, to hammer in the public's head of the supposed end times and our culpability at bringing it on. They quote articles and studies wildly, without explaining the uncertainties, the holes. And don't let my words in this video, the noise of climate change content abroad, lessen the quality of your biases. This is an op-ed, not a scholarly expose. Climate change activism is impotent because of the solutions proposed. They are dangerously stupid and absurdly hypocritical. They are impotent and powerless against the power structures and systems of control that they believe themselves to be combating, or the antithesis of, vox populi. And this powerlessness may be a good thing, because exacting net zero is genocidal. It has to be, and who gets to make those decisions? I don't want these people to. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not an expert. I dropped out of both high school and college. I read 3 books in preparation for this video, and my knowledge of the climate is just a hair above cursory at best. I can tell you about methane emissions, aerosols, and the Earth's albedo, failures, and advantages of the Texan power grid, the asymmetry of emissions from a global point of view, and other tangents. But that's about it. I'm aware I don't know enough about climate science to have any real opinions on it, but I can dutifully call bullshit at the culture surrounding its communication. I'm open to harsh criticism for my ignorance. I don't mind being wrong or ill-informed on this specific issue. I don't believe it ought to be a political scuffle either whenever this topic is brought up, although we all kind of understand why it is. One can have healthy skepticism of the climate emergency narrative and still agree that fossil fuels and our traditional methods of energy capture and our propensity to emit grody molecules that damage the environment, all of that ought to be slowed and inevitably ceased, which I do believe. One can wonder if the stark warnings of our past doomsayers, in 15 years, global crop failure. In 20 years, Florida will be underwater. In 50 years, the global population will halve from the deaths by exposure caused by carbon levels in the atmosphere. In 100 years, humanity will be extinct by similar processes. Yeah, one can wonder if these predictions are all that likely or certain, and still advocate for renewable energies. Besides wind, you're retarded if you're a windmill guy. Can't help you. I think the best arguments I can make against business as usual are as follows. Pollution is terrible for our health, and emissions from agriculture, energy, manufacturing, transportation ought to be a public health and environmental issue, not just a left-right, extreme moderate debate. Oil, gas, and coal burning should have been obsolesced decades ago in the developed, wealthy world. I mean, we live in the fucking future, right? And the fact that they haven't is emblematic of repeated failures to innovate, which doesn't bode well for humanity's survival. Solar and nuclear are clearer and more efficient alternatives and ought to have been subsidized as heavily as oil and gas have been historically. The intersections between state and big oil are corrupt and intolerable and ought to be slowly dismantled to secure our future. The military-industrial complex is the biggest polluter in the world. I don't know if you knew that. Those arguments, to some ears, would color me a rabid climate change activist, or worse, a liberal. But I'm neither. To reiterate, this lack of belief of the climate change narrative is born out of my own ignorance of climate science at the layman's margins, and the notion of the ignorance of climate scientists, what they know and what they don't know, which ought to be celebrated and communicated because it's a fascinating field and we ought to steer it unmarred in a holistic direction. All in all, the methods and measures we take to combat climate change are, a lot of the time, heightening our awareness and measurements of our collective effect on the environment, and no shit, that's a good thing. Let me postscript this video with an acknowledgement of my biases. At the risk of being tagged as a contrarian or a right-wing extremist or whatever the fuck, I have a lack of belief in the climate change narrative. Specifically, the continual usage of the words crisis and emergency. I'm skeptical of the things advocated for in combating climate change and the policy proposals of government and NGOs who assist in drafting the key points in legislation, or in the literature produced by organizations representing the collective work of climate scientists and their cross-disciplinary colleagues, and the overall ethos of the climate change activist movement and their organizations like Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Enda Glende, etc. I'm just not convinced of the crisis narrative, and I furrow my brow at the seeming necessity of the Wikipedia article that is always providing context underneath videos like these. I have a strong suspicion a lot of intelligent, well-meaning people are parroting extraordinary claims without the requisite knowledge to make those claims. And the track record of cataclysmic predictions should be evidence enough as to why we ought not hastily wrench business as usual and expend trillions of dollars and millions of man-hours on combating phenomena that we likely have no control over or have a painfully insufficient understanding of. I'm curious to see where the science will be in the future, and I'd bet money that a greater understanding of climate will contradict this climate emergency narrative we've been inundated with. But it's not optimism funding that kind of bet. It's just default humanity. It's hard to kill us, yet nature is indifferent to our survival. We can blaze this humanist trail, straying further away from nature's binds, or we can primitivize, return to monkey, and live harmoniously with the ecosystem. Yet both paths end, at all likelihood, at our extinction. Civilization globalized can surely fall in stupendous form, from fire to rubble, then back to brick. But that's only if the minds who'd toss into this bet, the billions who'd bet on default humanity, the millions who'd up the ante and egg on some side action, and the few 100,000 high rollers, privileged, out of touch, and drenched in the guilt of original sin, when they bet against default humanity, where will they cash in their chips? What do they win? Half-baked gambling analogies aside, if this idea is wrong, then it didn't really matter anyways because we weren't long for this world, I guess. That solves everything. Opiated bullshit usually does. And let's be honest, do you really believe that humanity won't survive to the 22nd century unless we're all vegans and Tesla drivers by then? Simply put, the knowledge required to proclaim this kind of shit is absent and partial. The soul of climate change activism, especially the religious fervor, is bloodless. Miss me with that bullshit.